good morning. It's actually good morning in Oklahoma. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. This is Middle East Insights platform. My name is Dr. Shubda Chaudhary. And today we are going to talk on a very, very critical aspect. Like what is shadow war in Syria? Now, you need to know, you all know what is a shadow, but you need to know where is Syria properly geographically. But what is the impact of Israel's airstrikes that are continuing and Turkey's military expansion, maritime expansion? So, what is the impact of all of it on Syria that is currently having a new government after December 9th when Assad regime was dislodged? And for that, I am really very happy to have our guest today. And this is like a dream come true for me at a personal level. Anyone who has been following Syria knows our guest, and any kind of introduction will just be a facade, but I'll do a brief introduction. So we have Professor Joshua Landis today. He's Sandra Mackey Chair and Professor in Middle East Studies at Oklahoma, US, Co-Director, Center for Middle East Studies, Director, Farzaneh Family Center for Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies. He writes and manages Syria Comment, a daily newsletter on Syrian politics, and publishes frequently in policy journals such as Foreign Affairs, Middle East Policy, and Foreign Policy. All of you read research papers from them. He has also his book Syria at Independence, Nationalism, Leadership and Failure of Republicanism will be published by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies this coming year. He's a frequent analyst on TV, radio and in print, and is regular on NPR and the BBC. He has received 3 Fulbright grants, 3, to support his research in Syria and won numerous prizes for his teaching. He is past president of Syrian Studies Association. He has lived 15 years in Middle East and 4 years in Syria. He spent most summers in Syria before the uprising of 2011. He was educated at Swarthmore in bachelor's, Harvard in MA, Princeton for PhD. His recent publications are US Troops Should Have Left Syria and Iraq Long Ago in 2024, How to Win the Influence Contest in Middle East, The Pointless Cruelty of Trump's New Syrian Sanctions, which will continue, I guess, Why Syria is the Gordian Knot of Obama's and anti-ISIL campaign, Stay Out of Syria, Why Assad is Likely to Survive. So with this, sir, thank you so much for the privilege of your time.
Shubda, it's a pleasure being on your show, and I'm very honored.
Thank you so much, sir. So I am just going to start with the $1 trillion question. According to you, what exactly is HTS?
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is used to be al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda wing in Syria. Of course, it's evolved considerably from that period of time. It's changed its name. The leader, Ahmed Shara, who used to be called Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, that was his nom de guerre. He's thrown out most of the jihadists who wanted to continue fighting in Europe. So he has said that the revolution is over. This is to reassure the Saudis, Jordanians, and all the Arab potentates who are worried that he would continue to agitate for revolution around the Middle East. And he said that is not his intention, and that he only wants to focus on Syria's economic development. That's the language that he's using today. But of course, many of his cadres in the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are quite Salafi and hard-bitten fighters and so he has to keep his base happy. And we saw that most recently on the coastal region, in the Alawite region of Syria, where in the middle of March, in the beginning of March, 6th, 7th, 8th, there were large-scale massacres of Alawites. And that's in part because he let loose these fighters there. And they took revenge on Alawites, killing many civilians, not directing their anger at regime Falul al-Nizam is what they call them, the sort of remainders of the regime. But any rate, it has changed a lot, and Europe and the West and the whole world are trying to gauge to what extent this change is only superficial, and to what extent Ahmed Shara is really a pragmatist who is trying to figure out how to consolidate his rule in Syria and get along with the other Arab states in order to develop Syria and to put it back on a good footing. And many Syrians, I have to say, are very enamored of Ahmed Shara. His charm campaign has won the hearts, particularly of the Sunni Arab population in Syria, which of course is 70% of the Syrian population. The minorities are much more skeptical, and they're not under control. Most of them, the regions, minority regions, whether it's the Kurds in the north, the Druze in the south, the Alawite region in the west, are only partially under state control. So he isn't. He doesn't fully govern Syria today in any way.
And how do you think that he was, or HTS was able to suddenly gain power within a short span of a week or so in Syria? Assad had to leave. Suddenly everything broke down.
It did. It did. It was quite extraordinary, and I don't think many people expected it to collapse like a house of cards. But it did. And it did in part because Assad was really a brittle ruler and not pragmatic the way Ahmed Shara was. He didn't get along well with the Russians. He annoyed the Russians. He annoyed the Turks. Turkey had been asking him for a long time to come and meet with Erdogan and to make some compromises. He refused to do that. So he was very stubborn, and that alienated most of his allies. But most of all, I think there are two other major factors. One is that the country had really gone bankrupt. American sanctions and international sanctions had hollowed out the Syrian regime. And officers were getting paid about $30 a month, enlisted men about $10 a month. And they didn't want to fight anymore. And many of them had gone home. So the army just began to collapse. It didn't have its allies. Russia was preoccupied in Ukraine. Hezbollah, which normally had been very crucial, had just been destroyed or decimated by Israel. And Iran had had its ears pinned back by Israel as well. So the traditional allies of Assad, who had really bolstered his regime in the past, were not there to come and save him. And his army melted away. And in a very short time, Ahmed Shara, with only 30,000 really troops under his command and some other militias that were pro-Turkish, swept to Damascus, and Assad fled the country.
And what exactly, because HTS grew supposedly in Idlib.
Yes.
There is no record of human rights abuse that they have done in Idlib with the Druze community or others.
No, there is. There's significant human rights abuses. They tried to repair some of those. Initially, they had been very inimical towards the Druze population. The Druze, like the Alawites and the Ismailis, are a heterodox Shiite sect. By the Salafis and by many Sunnis, they're not considered Muslims. They're considered to be polytheists in the same way that Hindus are considered to be polytheists by Salafi Muslims. And Article 3 of the Constitution in Syria, the new constitution that Ahmed Shara has, it's a transitional, a temporary constitution, but for the next 5 years. But in Article 3, it says that the state respects heavenly religions. And heavenly religions is only the Abrahamic religions. That means Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Those are the three religions which the Quran accepts were descended from heaven, that God, the angel Gabriel transmitted them to mankind, first to the Jews, then to the Christians with the New Testament, and ultimately Khatam al-Anbiya Muhammad brings the Quran to mankind. And those are but the Shiites and Alawites and Druze, for example, the Alawites deify Ali. And this is going too far beyond the bounds of religion. And so they're considered to be a man-made religion that expresses the animal desires of humanity. And that's true for all of the other religions of the world that are not those three religions. So even though in parts of the Constitution it says that they have that all religions are equal, it also says that the state only honors these heavenly religions, which is code for, which is not even code. It just means these three regular religions. So you can see the tension within the Constitution, and for that reason, when Nusra first took over Idlib province, they destroyed many of the Druze shrines. They persecuted the Druze. The Christians all fled within 48 hours. Later, Ahmed Shara, when he was wooing the West, met with Christian dignitaries and Druze dignitaries and said that they could get their land back, much of which had been expropriated, and began to look into ways to do that. So he came around full circle to trying to say that he honors these different and respects these different religions, but that was not always the case. The new minister of justice in Syria, that was appointed in the first temporary government, had executed a number of women for adultery. So these, women, of course, were very disturbed by this, as many people were, and these are the. So he has a mixed record in Idlib. Of course, he began to take a much more liberal view in his last years in Idlib. And that's when he went to Damascus, he said he would not impose any kind of dress on Syrians, and he would not impose religion on Syrians. This is very different from his attitude in Idlib. In Idlib, he imposed dress code, he separated the sexes, so forth. But once he got to Damascus, he realized he couldn't do that, because so many Syrians are secular. There's a great deal of equality between women and men. Of course, all the minorities chafe under that Islamic legalism. So he has moderated his position tremendously and been very pragmatic in his approach.
And how do you think, what was Turkey's role in backing HTS? What did Turkey gain out of it?
Oh, well, Turkey now is in the driver's seat in Syria. Turkey is Turkey, by arming and protecting and financing Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and these other militias, is the real winner in this, because over half the ministers in his government have Turkish nationality, because they spent over a decade in Turkey, and they got nationality. And so they're very obliged to Turkey. Turkey wants to sign a defense agreement with Syria. Shara has not done that officially yet, but he's very dependent on Syria for his military weaponry, because America won't give him weapons. China will not give him weapons because he's put a lot of Uyghurs. These are East Turkestan, the province in the western province, of China, that it has Turks in it, has Uyghurs in it. Of course, many of those fighters are in Syria today, about 5,000. They've been given nationality, and some of them have been given high positions within the new army. And so China is upset at that. And Syria is loath to go to Russia today because Russia had supported Assad so much, although Russia is negotiating with Syria over potential military aid. But so Turkey is the unique supplier today of military weaponry and to help rebuild the Syrian army. Because as soon as Ahmed Shara took over Damascus, Israel began to bomb all the military emplacements from the old Assad army and destroyed. It has bombed Syria over 700 times since December, since the December takeover. And that means that Shara really doesn't have a military. It doesn't have anything beyond pickup trucks with big dushkas on the back and other military weaponry. He's got a few tanks that have been salvaged, but he doesn't have a military. And he's going to be dependent on Turkey to rebuild that, and Turkish support economically to rebuild the roads, to set up the new phone systems. For example, all of the new passports and identity cards being issued to Syrians are being printed and done through Turkey, because the Turkish companies have taken over that job. So almost all the backroom stuff for financing Syria is being helped along by Turkey. So Turkey has a tremendous amount of influence, and that's what frightens Israel so much.
But the support for Erdogan, what if it collapses because there's massive protests going on against him? Will Turkey continue to support HTS?
I think it will. At this point, Turkish businessmen are eager to invest in Syria. Syria is such a big backdoor. It also means transportation, because today, Turkey, in order to get their goods to the Gulf, Turkey is sending trucks to the port of Haifa in Israel, where they then drive across Israel, that go through the Allenby Bridge to Jordan and down into Saudi Arabia. And that's the way transport during the Civil War was being carried out. Now, Turkey can rebuild the roads through Syria, and all of that transport routes through Syria down to the Gulf will be opened once again, and it'll save Turkey a tremendous amount of money, and it'll help with Turkish business to be connected to the Gulf, as well as energy supplies back and forth. There had been a plan for Qatar to build a gas pipeline through Syria to Europe, and Turkey was deeply involved in that, and all of that was shelved, of course, because of the Civil War. But these plans will be on the table once again. So Turkey has an interest, no matter who's ruling Turkey. There'll be a deep interest in keeping Syria close and helping it to rebuild.
And now turning to the Israel, as you said that Israel had started bombing just after, 8th of December. Netanyahu government has clearly stated that they are not going to give up on the territory that they have seized now in Syria. They also want to support the Druze community with or without their consent in Syria. Turkey and Syria had a negotiation in Azerbaijan recently, which did not have any result. What do you think is Israel's fear because Assad was very, docile to Netanyahu?
Yes. Well, Israel wants a weak and divided Syria. If you think of it from an Israeli point of view, they don't want their neighbors to be strong. They want weak neighbors. Today, Israel has complete control of Syria's skies. They can overfly Syria with its planes and bomb at will, which they do every other day. And they want to maintain that because it's to their advantage. They also fear Turkey because Erdogan has, in a sense, put the mantle of leadership on his shoulders for the Islamic world and for the Levant, clearly, and for Syria in particular. And he has made a number of statements that are anti-Israel. He's said anybody who tries to disturb the peace in Syria is an enemy of Turkey. He has recently said that the Zionist state should be destroyed. And so Israel looks at him as a potentially more powerful enemy than the Ayatollahs, than the influence of Iran in Syria. Now, Israel was very interested in getting rid of Iran from Syria and overturning the Assad regime, or at least it claimed it wanted to overturn the Assad regime, but it certainly wanted Iran out and Iranian influence with Hezbollah and so forth to be destroyed. It achieved that. But of course, almost the next day, Israel said Turkey could be worse than Iran because it has a much more developed military capacity. It's part of NATO. It has Europe. Europe is not entirely dependent, but Europe is very close to Turkey because much of the manufacturing in Europe comes from Turkey. So for all those reasons, Israel is worried that if Turkey builds air bases in Syria, it will deny Israel capacity to overfly Syria. It will set up anti-aircraft missiles in Syria and help Syria build a strong army. And for that, Israel does not want a strong army, so it's been bombing. And it has warned Turkey. It just bombed the big empty airport now that's in the center of the country near Palmyra in the desert, right in the very middle, where Turkey wanted to set up and help Syria reestablish an air base there. And Israel has bombed it numerous times and has pitted all of the runways so Turkish airplanes cannot land there. And this is a warning to Turkey, as Netanyahu has said to Erdogan. This is a red line, and we don't want to see Turkey building a defensive, helping Syria build its military. So that's where Israel's stand is. It is a very self-serving. It's going to, of course, hurt Syrians tremendously because because Turkey has come out on the side of the minorities against Damascus. It has forbidden Shara from deploying the Syrian army south of Damascus. That's probably 15% of Syria. And it includes the Druze minority. So all of a sudden, Shara is lost a tremendous amount of territory in a sense because the militias that are in the south, independent from Damascus, do not have to give up their arms today. The government can't deploy troops down there and bring them under the government control. So Israel is playing a very, from Damascus's point of view, a very inimical and destructive role. And the Arab world sees it the same way, and they're furious at this, and they want the United States to put pressure on Israel to withdraw from the new territories it's conquered and to allow Syria to rebuild.
Trump is trying that they should have, as you have also tweeted, that Trump is trying to put pressure on Netanyahu, whatever that means. To have
right, and that's a good, that's an important thing because according to some sources, Syria in Transition, one of the a fairly reliable source, quoted a number of American officials saying that in his meeting with Netanyahu, President Trump told Netanyahu that he could take as much Syrian territory as he wanted. Now, I haven't seen that reprinted in the New York Times, but it's very possible that that's true because Washington has not objected to Israel's conquest of additional territory beyond the Golan Heights, which it had already integrated into Israel. But it took a new buffer zone, and it, of course, has imposed this ban on Syria from deploying south of Damascus. And you would think that Washington would say Israel shouldn't do this and can't do it, but it has not.
And it might sound as a conspiracy theory, but do you think that the protests that suddenly started going viral on social media and the impact of it in Turkey against Erdogan were natural, or were they some agenda by any of
No, I
the.
think, Erdogan took this extra step to ensure his continued rule over Turkey. And he arrested the mayor of Istanbul, Imamoglu, and he's arrested many other officials in Istanbul. So he has really swept up the opposition, put them into jail, accused them of corruption and many other crimes. And this has Turks terrified that they're going to be like Russia, and that Erdogan is turned into Putin, where there is no even pretense of constitutional rule anymore. And that's why these widespread demonstrations in Turkey, which have been persistent now for well over a month, I don't think anybody's feels that Erdogan is going to be overthrown by these elections, but it certainly hurts his reputation, both in Europe and in the larger world and amongst Turks, who, of course, many Turks are very distressed by this. So it weakens him at the same time as it strengthens him because he has control over the country.
And what is Shara thinking about? Though they have tried to have a deal with the SDF, but what would the Kurdish population that controls most of the oil areas in Syria have a role
Right.
to play?
That is a very difficult question to answer because, as you know, American troops help Kurdish-led militia, the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they were named by an American colonel. Everything has to be democratic in America, or at least have the name on it. But America controls about 30% of Syrian territory through its proxy militias, and that most of Syria's oil is in the northeast under the control of the Kurdish-led government of northeast Syria. And they use it to pay their troops, and they don't send it to Damascus. So Shara is upset by this. Of course, he wants that oil back to Damascus. Now, America has announced that it is drawing up plans to consolidate. It calls it consolidate. The newspapers are talking about withdrawal. But America's plan is not to leave. It's to go from 2,000 troops down to 1,000. And it was at 1,000 before Shara took over, and then it expanded up to 2,000. And now it's going to go back down in the next few months. We don't know. Trump has talked about pulling out of Syria and saying that Syria is not that important to the United States. But many of his advisors take a very different line. So it's hard to tell what Trump's long-term plan is for Syria. Of course, the State Department has said that they're going to take a step-by-step plan towards the future of Syria. They are not going to lift sanctions. They did say that the new constitution was a step in the right direction, and they have lifted a few of the sanctions against energy, against the central bank, very crucial sanctions, but it has not suspended the entire sanction edifice, which really freezes the Syrian economy, which is devastating for the Syrian government. And that's connected to the Kurdish question and this whole Kurdish region. And the Kurdish leadership is taking a very strong line and saying, we want federalism. We want a large degree of autonomy in the Northeast. We want to keep our own troops, protecting our own people up here in the Northeast. And Shara does not want that. So there is an incipient enmity or conflict between these two groups. They have negotiated a deal that would theoretically bring the Northeast under Damascus's control, but allow it a large degree of autonomy. But that has yet to be implemented. And it's going to be, the principle is one of integration and federalism, but it's unclear how, the parameter, the devil is in the details, and how that is going to be carried out, we don't know.
And so you have mentioned that any future Turkey-Syria maritime agreement will deepen the standoff between Israel and Turkey. What do you mean by that?
Well, in the this comes in a larger context of Turkish aggrievement about its control over the Aegean Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. We have to go back to the First World War, because after the First World War, in the Lausanne Agreement of 1923, the Allied powers who had won World War I against the Ottoman Empire and destroyed the Ottoman Empire gave much of the coastal waters and much of the Aegean Sea to Greece. And many of the islands right off the shore of Anatolia, of Turkey, are Greek. And you can stand in Turkey and look out and see these islands just a few miles off the shore of Anatolia. And they're Greek, and they have Greek flags flying. And Turkey is very bitter about this. Now comes the discovery of big gas deposits in the Mediterranean. And Turkey wants to be able to exploit that gas. It doesn't want it to all go to Greece. And so Turkey has been quite aggressive in imposing new guidelines for whose oil that is and whose gas it is and who has the right to dig under those ocean. Now, Syria, a lot of that, about 20% of the reserves that we believe are under there, are off Syria's coast. So Turkey is trying to hammer out an agreement with Ahmed Shara over all these coastal waters to decide where the line is between Turkey and Syria, and to help Syria begin to exploit that oil and gas. But Greece is very worried that Turkey is going to encroach on what it considers its territory and its gas. And Israel, of course, is teaming up with Greece and Egypt to build a gas pipeline that would go straight across to Greece and into Europe. And they're hoping that much of the Gulf gas and oil would go through Israel, through Cyprus to Greece, and get to Europe that way. Turkey, of course, wants it to go through Turkey. And so there's real arm wrestling. This is another layer of the competition between Israel and Turkey, not just over Syria, but over gas rights, pipelines, control of the Mediterranean Sea, you name it.
And you also mentioned that June is going to be a very important month for US-Syria relations, in which you mentioned the confirmation of Joel Rayburn as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, and much more. So why do you think is June important? Trump is also going to visit Saudi Arabia, I think, soon.
Right. There's a number of decisions the United States has to make, and it really hasn't developed its Syria policy very clearly. It has been U.S. policy towards Syria hasn't been articulated very clearly, and because it's being pulled between Turkey and Israel, between Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Israel, and there are many people in the administration itself some who are inimical to Ahmed Shara, believe that a leopard does not change its spots, that he was Al-Qaeda before, and he remains in his heart Al-Qaeda. And they don't want to give him, they don't see him as an ally. Other people are much more willing to look at him and say, what's the alternative to Ahmed Shara? Shul Badil, as they say in Syria. What is the alternative? If he were to be unsuccessful, Syria will be divided. It may fall back into civil war. There'll be more refugees. It'd be a disaster for the Middle East. So that's the argument that many people are using for why America should lift the sanctions immediately, let Syria rebuild. 90% of Syrians are in desperate poverty. They don't have electricity for most of the day. I mean, the country is in just terrible shambles. And people are living people are on the edge of starvation, and many people are food insecure. So there's a good argument for why one would support him, even if they don't agree with his Salafi Islamist outlook. But Syria needs to regrow. And he is the only leader that has national reputation. He has tremendous amount of revolutionary legitimacy, as they're calling it in the political science world, because he overthrew Assad and took Damascus, which nobody thought he could do. And the big mantra in Damascus these days is "Illi yuharrar yuqarrar." In Arabic, it has a sing-songy rhyme, but it means the person who liberates Damascus gets to decide what happens in Damascus. So many Syrians are giving a lot of latitude to Shara to act and behave however he thinks best, because he is seen as their liberator who has swept in. And I think that argument is persuasive amongst many people in the international community. But to come back to the Trump policy, Trump is still struggling with how to move forward and how much latitude to give to Netanyahu, and whether to back him up fully or to side with Erdogan, who he also likes. And we saw in the last interview when Netanyahu went to Washington last week, they sat down together. The sort of high point of the televised meeting, part of the meeting, was when he told Netanyahu, Trump said to Netanyahu, you've got to be reasonable with Turkey. Erdogan's my good friend, and I'm amazed that he's been able to take Syria. It's the first time anybody has taken Syria in 2,000 years, which of course is not very far from the truth. But he was singing the praises of Erdogan, and in a sense, letting Netanyahu know that he doesn't have a free hand in Syria. And that expresses the balancing act that Washington and Trump administration is now playing with Syria between its two major allies, Turkey, a NATO member, and Israel, of course, with a special relationship to the United States. So America is going to begin to put its people into position for Damascus, and that means that they're going to be making a number of big decisions. And also in June, America gave a 6-month suspension of some of these sanctions. And in June, that 6-month mark comes due. And so the U.S. administration is going to have to decide, do we suspend them again? Do we add to the more sanctions that are suspended? It'll be a time to see where U.S. policy is going in this towards Syria.
And so what do you think would be, because no one knows how ISIS actually, as a phoenix, rises up. So with the major desert area of Syria, which were still under ISIS control, what do you think ISIS is going to, or Al-Qaeda for that matter, would there be some other kind of reincarnation in the coming years?
So far this year, ISIS attacks are quite diminished compared to last year. Now, in part, I think that's due to the fact that Ahmed Shara is a Salafist himself. He comes from Al-Qaeda. He was a member of ISIS. Caliph Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, sent him to Damascus to create a wing of Al-Qaeda in Syria. So he has the credentials of ISIS in his back pocket, if you will, at least ideologically. He's been a member of that group. So he can, for the average Syrian, when it was Assad, it was very easy to be an Islamist against Assad, but to be an Islamist against Ahmed Shara is much more difficult. And so I think recruiting for ISIS is going to be much more difficult. On the other hand, the tension between the Kurdish enclave, American-backed Kurdish enclave, and Damascus, leaves, as long as there's tension and there's not one government controlling this whole territory, there is going to be room for ISIS to run between the legs of the Kurds versus Damascus and Turkey versus the Kurds, because all of these forces are really much more worried about each other than they're worried about ISIS. So ISIS has been able to proliferate because of those warring parties fighting over this territory. And so long as they're fighting over that territory, ISIS is going to be able to wiggle between their legs and maintain some bases in the desert area of Syria. And of course, will have some legitimacy amongst the population in the region.
And how is Hezbollah, Houthis, Iran going to tackle with HTS in the near future?
Boy, Hezbollah is under tremendous pressure right now, of course, to give up its arms. And we already see, America has been reiterating over and over again that Lebanon government has to occupy all the Hezbollah bases and take away their arms. This is very difficult for the Lebanese government to do because 1/3 of all Lebanese are Shia, and many of those Shia support Hezbollah one way or the other. So Hezbollah is really on its back feet right now, and it's just trying to hang on in Lebanon. How does Iran reposition itself in the region? Of course, Iran has tremendous influence in Iraq, and its militias are in Iraq. And as long as there's grievances in Syria, which there are amongst the minorities, whether it's the Kurds, the Druze, the Alawites, Iran will be fishing in those troubled waters. Right now, I don't think there is tremendous amount of Iran influence in Syria. The government occasionally says there is, but I think that's more to frighten people. I think Iran is very confused right now. It's carrying out these negotiations with the United States. It's very worried that Israel will bomb it and really pound the regime. And we just, in the New York Times yesterday, it was a long article about how Israel wanted to bomb and pushed Trump's government and Israeli government to come up with a plan to bomb Iran in May. And Trump ultimately waved that away and said, we're not going to do it because it relied on America and American planes and American military to do a lot of the heavy lifting in this Iran campaign. And of course, it could lead to Iran closing the Straits of Hormuz and oil prices going way up and attacking Gulf states. One doesn't know where this war could proliferate and how it would get out of control. So Trump said no to that plan. Erdogan is clearly very upset, but Iran is engaged in these negotiations, and it has to take those negotiations very seriously because otherwise that bombing plan might be resurrected. So this is high stakes diplomacy, and I think Iran is really preoccupied right now with engaging in that diplomacy, shoring up its support in Iraq, and with the Houthis in Yemen, which are its two major areas of support. But it's on its back feet, and it's trying to figure out how not to get bombed, which would be a real disaster for it.
Yeah. And so my last question to you is that how much time will you give to Sharra, that he will continue to be the interim president? And do you think that in the coming years, Syria will be partitioned or divided?
Yeah. Boy, it requires a lot of of crystal ball here. The honeymoon for Sharra continues. He has generated a great deal of goodwill from the Sunni Arab majority in Syria, who are very excited because he's quite capitalist. He's for free trade. He wants foreign investment. He's making the rounds to all the Gulf countries, and he's entertaining many of the wealthy Syrians who've been exiled from the country for decades, some of them. And many of them are eager to come back and see if they can put their shoulder to the wheel and help Syria develop and find a place for themselves in this new Syria. And he's been very open to that, at least so far. So I think that he is going to gain, I think he has a lot of goodwill from many Syrians, and that's going to help him move forward. Now, he is a Sunni supremacist. He believes in protecting the Sunnis, and that's what his mantra was in Idlib. Now, coming to Damascus, he's had to tone that down a little bit because he has all these minorities now under his arms. But he's not speaking. He says he's going to include all elements of Syria, but he put one Kurd minister, one Alawite minister, one Druze minister. It's very token, and they're not an important portfolios. He's got a Christian woman as well, one woman. So he's very Sunni, and that's going to be a stumbling block for him in uniting the country. Israel is, of course, very inimical and is protecting the Druze in the south, and the United States is protecting the Kurds in the north. It's going to be hard for him to unify the country like that. It's going to, but he has the core of Syria. He has the four major cities: Aleppo, Hama, Homs, Damascus. That's where the vast majority of the population resides. And he's concentrating on that inner core. And he's, in a sense, allowing these minorities, compact minorities in the peripheries, to have a fairly large degree of autonomy. He doesn't give it to them willingly. He says he wants centralization. He's biding his time. But in the meantime, he doesn't want to hit them. First of all, because he doesn't have the military force. And secondly, because he knows the West and others will continue sanctions. So he's playing a long game of allowing these minorities some breathing room because he has to. And he's building up the center. But how he will ultimately be able to bring Syria together and make all Syrians feel that they have equality in his country is still a big question mark, because that's where his Salafi background, his Al-Qaeda background, really hinders him. It has gotten him a lot of loyalty from many Sunni Arabs, but many of the minorities and more secular Syrians look at him with deep anxiety because he's not a Democrat, and he's a Sunni supremacist who has been very pragmatic. But we'll have to see how he can continue to, in a sense, file off the rough edges of his old jihadi days and become a representative of all Syrians.
So with this, sir, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. And I still can't believe it that we were able to do this. And if I look back to who I was, 10 years, 12 years down the line, I would have been very proud of this moment. So thank you so much. And the best thing about your analysis is that the various, along with the factual elements, the skin in the game that you explain in a very simple way so that everyone can understand. They say that anyone can complicate, but it takes a genius to simplify. So,
you're very flattering, Dr. Shubda. It's a real pleasure to be with you and to get to talk with you today.
Thank you so much, sir. And thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.